But it is my absolute pleasure to introduce our first speaker, and that's Professor Maha Bali. Maha is an associate professor of practice at the Center for Learning and Teaching at the American University in Cairo, and she's a full-time educational developer working with staff, and she also teaches digital literacies and intercultural learning at undergraduate level. Now, many of Maha's diverse research interests are reflected in her engagement as an editorial board member of several academic journals. Let me just give you some examples. That's Teaching in Higher Education, Learning, Media and Technology, International Journal of Educational Technology in Higher Education, and Journal of Pedagogic Development. Now, Maha is also an editor at Hybrid Pedagogy, and that's the Journal of Critical Pedagogy, which is really a space, a learning space. It's more than a journal in that sense. It's a community, it's a conversation, it's a collaboration. And this is where I found Maha this time last year. While I was browsing for the journal and its website, I came across Maha's contribution dated the 20th of April, 2015. And it starts with words which really express so much how I feel about education. And I'm going to quote, "Sometimes the most valuable thing we can offer our students is genuine care for them, their well-being, their happiness, not just their grades, not just their learning, but their whole selves." And this caring and holistic approach to students is very much what would guide me in my practice. But I have to say, in the time of global pandemic raging on, these words really guided me, helping my students navigate through the lockdowns, quarantines, transitions, and the fear of unknown. Now, in line with her passion about social justice, critical pedagogy, and open and online education, Maha is also a co-founder and a co-director of Virtually Connecting, and that's a grassroots movement that challenges academic gatekeeping at conferences. And she also is a co-facilitator of Equity Unbound. And this is an equity-focused, open, connected intercultural curriculum, which she will talk about more today. You can find Maha on Twitter. She's also a very active blogger. And in brief, and to follow her own words, she's a learnaholic, a writeaholic, passionate, open and connected educator. Maha, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Ivanka. I really appreciate this very personal introduction. Rather than just reading out my bio, makes a huge difference. So I appreciate that. Thank you very much. And thank you, Dustin, for posting all the links to make it easier for folks to follow along. So I'm going to be talking to you today about creating equitable, caring communities online. And just to note that these colorful stars were made by my daughter and me together. She helped me design my slides. So. Starting out with Assalamu alaikum, because this works like no matter what time of day it is for you, it just means peace be upon you. And I like to start my sessions by asking, how are you feeling and where are you? So kind of like Sleepless in Seattle kind of thing. So I'm saying, I'm excited in Cairo in a club, an outdoor clubhouse right now. What about you? I'll pause and see what people are saying in the chat. I think especially during the pandemic, it's important to ask how people are feeling. Enthusiastic in Verona. Alaikum salam, thank you. Excited and buzzing, awake. It's good enough that you're awake. I mean, at this point, caffeinated, I'm seeing. Sunburnt, wow, already. Curious in London, connected. Snowy in Switzerland, chilly in Edinburgh. And I know there's people from Brazil. Okay, tired, yeah, it's gonna come up, tired, exhausted, overwhelmed these days. Enthusiastic and vast. Cerulean skies, we've got a poet here. Happy in Hong Kong, that kind of rhymes. Enjoying the conference so far. Baking in Oman must be really hot. Yeah. Cozy in Stockholm. Stuck in Samsara. I can't read that one. Bonjour, Pomplante. Okay. Chilly, happy. All right. Thank you for sharing that. Just letting you know, the plan for today is we just did the checking in. I'm going to invite you to join me in a quick chatterfall. I'm going to ask you about certain things, and then I'm going to talk about these three things, which shouldn't have been invented, but anyway. I'm going to talk about levels of care. And I'm glad that Ivona focused on that particular post in terms of care, because I updated it for the pandemic, right? talk about equity and equality, and something I've developed with a colleague called Mia Zamora called the Equity Care Matrix. And then I'm going to go into very practical tips for community building. And even though these were not developed for language teaching, I teach currently a course in computer-assisted language learning, and my students are finding them really helpful. And then I'm going to hope to hear from you about your key takeaways from today. If you prefer to follow along the slides on your own, or if you want to look at them later and comment on them, here's the link. I'm happy for you to keep engaging with them later or in the forums inside the platform later. So feel free to do that. And I just want to say this thing before I start, which is keynotes appear like the work of one person, but they're really inspired by a lot of people. There have been a lot of language teachers that I work with who inspired me in my faculty development role, and then my student teachers currently this semester who are language teachers. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to pose a question and ask you to just start responding in the chat, and I will read out some of what you say. So what gives you energy these days? Hopefully we can hear from different people. Coffee, yeah, that makes sense. Ideas, sunshine, students, colleagues. Light, music, my daughter, yes. Nature, I hear that one a lot. Dancing, yes. Jogging, family, walking, gardening. Feeling seen, doing sports, nature and movement, yoga and meditation, communication. All right, like-minded colleagues, community. I don't know what Taiji Kwan is. I'd be interested to know what that is. Lambs in the field next door, that's beautiful. And swans on the canal, that's beautiful. Yeah, I love animals and seeing them makes a difference to me a lot. Blossoms and trees. So I'm happy that it's springtime because a lot of what you guys are asking for. Ah, okay, thanks. Yes, and someone's cat. I'm playing guitar. Yes, I'm glad you have these things in your life. I've noticed that one of the things that gives me energy, I love teaching, obviously, and one of the things that helps me and my students have more energy in our Zoom sessions especially is having several short activities. I have less energy than I generally have, especially when I was recovering from COVID, and my students themselves were just fatigued by having a whole year of pandemic. I think when we hit the 1 year, just things started to feel suddenly much more exhausting than they were before. And I just found that just splitting everything up into smaller pieces helps maintain the energy somehow. Because I guess even if you're not enjoying one thing, it's over soon and then you're moving on to something else. All right, what's an important thing you achieved in the past year? It's been a tough year for many of us in different ways. What's something that you're happy that you achieved in the past year? Oh, you got your EDD. You know what? It would say if you finished your PhD in EDD, it should say, finish my PhD during a pandemic. That should be a different type of achievement than just getting a PhD any other time. Patience, yes. Resilience, online teaching, lots of DIY and painting. That's amazing. Adaptation, staying alive, first marathon. I think maybe now that I'm seeing some of these, thinking one of my achievements was that I let my daughter, who's now 9, but like a year ago, let her hold a knife on her own and help me with cooking. I think before that I would have taken a lot longer. Certified to facilitate trauma-sensitive yoga, that's amazing. Patience to make sushi, perseverance. Managing breakout rooms, that's a good one. I think that's also one of my achievements. I'm getting really good at that one. Couch to half marathon run, that's amazing too. Start a new job, congratulations. Finding ways around obstacles. Yeah, I think we've gone more creative and imaginative about that, haven't we? Okay, one of my achievements that I'm proudest of, and which I'm going to share with you later towards the end of the keynote in more detail, is this community building resource that I co-developed with Equity Unbound and 1HE. And we'll talk a little bit more about that, but I think it was maybe one of the most useful things I feel like I've contributed to the world and collaborated with others to create. And the last question here is, what is an unexpected thing that brought you peace or joy recently? Dealing with grief by reaching out for help. Tulips coming up. Oh, being introspective, silence, meditation, sunshine, daffodils, singing. Swimming with a seal. Wow. Magnolia tree, birds returning, seeing friends in my rugby team. Learn the ukulele, snowy forest. Easter chocolate. Yoga, children, nature and wildlife. Cooking, walking with family. Oh, it's beautiful. Well, I'm glad you have a lot of things to be grateful for and positive about in your lives these days. I think we've come to sort of appreciate the little things a lot more than usual. And I think one of the things that brought me unexpected, peace and joy recently is that doing daily gratitude with my daughter kept her positive during the time I had COVID. And I've been encouraging my students to do regular gratitude journaling, and it's been helping them a lot as well. Not in terms of like toxic positivity and just focusing as if there was nothing wrong, but just sort of trying to focus on the little things that do make them happy, to make their days better and to help them just generally feel more at peace with their lives. And there's a resource on using gratitude journaling for community building on the community building website that we have. Yeah, I see some of you also know about gratitude journaling. All right. I think it's really important to talk about equity and equality and not just care. For a lot of reasons, but mainly because, if you do the care without the equity and equality, then something's off, right? So you've probably seen an image similar to this one in your life before. The other one usually shows people looking at a baseball field, and being not American, that didn't make a lot of sense to me. Like, nobody really noticed what were these people looking at in the first place. I like this one because it's an agricultural example, and it's also easier to adapt for what I want to say next. So, I mean, clearly, the guy, the shorter yellow person, is not even reaching for the apple. Like, it's so far out of their reach, they're not even trying to get there. The person in the middle, at least, is trying to jump and get there. Obviously, the equity makes sure everyone can reach the same thing, even though they start out at different levels. But I want to challenge that, because not everyone wants an apple. What if someone wants an orange? Why do we assume that everyone wants an apple? And I think in EAP especially, people are learning languages. Obviously, EAP is for academic purposes, but people still have different goals and objectives for why they want to learn language and where they want to go with it. And then the other thing is that sometimes someone needs care more than apples on a day, more than fruits. And that may be invisible because they seem to be privileged and tall and able to reach the goals, but maybe there's something else that they need right now. And I think a lot of kinds of marginality are invisible, like class background sometimes, and sexuality, and chronic or temporary disability. Especially when you're communicating online, it can be more difficult to notice things like that. What additional images or edits to the image could we make to express nuances like that? Can you think of any? I'm just going to pause for a second, give you a chance to do that. I'm going to take a sip of water. Ooh, I really like climbing the tree, Nicholas. That's a really cool idea. Because then you can just empower the person to climb the tree and get their apple, and then it wouldn't matter what level of supports there are. We'll see one another higher up, so they're supporting each other in collaboration. The gender, yeah, they look like they're all male, but yeah. People are seeking different kinds of apples, walking away from the tree because maybe they don't need the tree at all. Might not even be a tree. There might be multiple trees. I agree, like different orchards. Leaving the tree and going to another one, tools to climb, choice of fruit within reach of all, helping each other. Yes. I love these. Useful tools. Buying the apple in a shop. Okay, different sizes of apples. That's a good point too. People have different appetites and needs. Going to a tree with different fruits. Jackfruit. I don't know what jackfruit is, but I like all of these that you've said. Collaborative climbing. I love that. Taking care of the tree. Oh, I love that. I hadn't thought about nurturing the tree itself. I love that. My students talked about creating a ladder with steps. Oh, sorry, that's just my alarm. Turning it off. And they said just give a ladder and then let people climb however they need to. So that's also an interesting way of thinking about that. But the image is quite static, right? Because it makes it seem like achieving equity or equality is a goal. You get it by doing this thing. But it's really a long haul type of thing. It's a marathon, not a sprint. And you need to, there are no shortcuts to this labor. It's a lifelong commitment, and you just have to keep doing it and exploring different ways. So no matter what you prepare ahead of time, which you should prepare ahead of time, it's a longer term thing. And I like that someone just wrote plant more trees, which I think is a good way of looking at it long term, right? Because this kind of thing takes time to grow, and you need to plan ahead and keep adding stuff to it. And, you know, with systemic inequality, there was a note from Twitter about how you need to take a door off its hinges completely so that, you know, if you just open a door, someone else might close it, but remove it entirely, and then you won't have a problem. It will never be shut again. So think about that metaphor and how that might work. And thinking about connecting social justice with care, Nell Noddings was really well known for her work about care pedagogy. talks about do unto others as they would have done unto them. And so I've taken that into do unto students as they would have done unto them. There are so many ways that we can care that can become harmful. It can be patronizing, it can be suffocating. But what about care where you empower students to do what they want with what their education is going to be? And this connects very well with Nancy Fraser's notion of parity of participation, where everyone has equal power to influence decision making in a space. And this doesn't mean that you as a teacher just step back, because stepping back as a teacher doesn't mean that there is no power dynamics between the students. So how do you make sure that that space is equitable between the students? And so one of the notions that I've been involved in thinking up is intentionally equitable hospitality. And this stems from our work with Virtually Connecting. And it starts with recognizing that you as a teacher, you're not just a teacher, especially when you're online, you're a host building a space, and hospitality for that space is your responsibility. How do you set up the space? Whom do you involve or listen to? How do you make each person feel welcome in that space? And then being intentional about it and recognizing you need to walk the talk. It won't happen automatically. And if you don't set that intention, things will happen and you'll say, I didn't realize. But every time you say, I didn't realize, and then you don't make a change the next time, is an intentional not realizing. You know what I mean? You have to intentionally look for issues of equity and try to redress them. And the equitable part is like, it's different to say, I'm going to be hospitable to all students. So you need to pay attention to the inequities faced by each student. And there, of course, this is really difficult the larger your class sizes are. But it's one of those things that as you learn about it, you can design for it ahead of time. And then the exceptions will be fewer and fewer as you make this your lifelong work. I'm going to show you now this equity care matrix. And before I show the equity care matrix, thinking about levels of care for us as individual teachers, there's the level of making sure your course philosophy and design and planning show care to students in our tone of voice, in the ways we design assessments and deadlines and how we plan things. And then there's also the habitual practices we have in class, like every day asking them how they're feeling, like just generally when we give a deadline, checking in that this deadline is going to work for most people and things like that. And then there's response in situations where students come up and ask for something with you in the entire class, and how you respond to that, and how sometimes it may trigger you, but how you respond in a caring way still. And then the last thing is the personal private, because sometimes you just need to help a student one-on-one behind the scenes, but something that didn't come up in your entire class, something you did not predict would happen or anticipate. And then these levels are still missing aspects of the system that, you know, make students powerless and anxious, and how can we redress that with being more flexible and playful and forgiving, but making sure that we interrogate the systems that hold students sometimes powerless and anxious as well, systems like proctoring and grades and things like that. So the question that I asked on Twitter a few months ago is, what is equity without care, and what is care without equity? And one of the responses to that was talking about how care without equity is fundamentally unjust, because it's like putting a Band-Aid on something. And equity without care can be harmful because it privileges a goal over the humanity of those engaged in that goal. And thinking about this pandemic especially, there have been issues with both equity and care. And I think a lot of our solutions were Band-Aids because the systems were not set up in place to ensure equity. So all of us had to do a lot of effective labor to get there. So we developed this sort of framework is if you have equity but no care, so you have policies, for example, that are meant to be equitable, but nobody who cares is implementing them. This may seem like systemic justice, but it actually can be lip service or diversity theater or tokenism because it's not really applied. And that if you have care without equity, that ends up could be selective, ineffective labor because you don't empathize equally. And then ameliorative, it can help solve a problem one-on-one, but it doesn't help the systemic issue. That's why it's like a Band-Aid. So we're hoping, Mia and I, in this model, to promote things like parity of participation and intentionally equitable hospitalities as approaches that recognize inequities in the system and then try to both create equity in the system, but also embody the care in our practices. And so this is where I get to talk about dimensions of community building centered on care and equity, which we've done with this 1HE site. that I'm going to post again in the chat. I'm going to pause for a second in case someone wants to ask a question. I saw a really interesting point about Turkey and how hospitality might resonate better. This, I guess that kind of makes sense. My culture is very close to Turkish culture, and I have Turkish ancestors too. And I think hospitality is a good, it is a good metaphor for our types of cultures where hospitality is such a big deal, right? So I'll just pause for a second, take a sip of tea, and if nobody has questions, I'll move on. Okay, am I talking too fast or am I talking at a good pace? It depends. Different audiences have different reactions to that. Okay, thanks. Sharon answered first, so her answer is the one I take in mind. All right, great, thank you. All right, so why we developed this online community building resource, and I don't know if any of you have ever actually seen it. If you have, let me know. It's currently got over 50 resources and it's getting a little unwieldy, but we're going to organize it so it's easier to navigate through. But I'll give you a few tips today to help you navigate through it as well. So first of all, what happened is that in July and August, I started to realize as an educational developer, many people who were new to teaching fully online had only had the experience of doing emergency remote teaching, but they'd never started teaching fully online without ever meeting their students at all. And they were so worried about the community building, especially the language teachers, because language courses were the ones where the teachers were obviously definitely interested in the pandemic, interested in pedagogy. Language teachers are always, in my institution at least, more interested in pedagogy than the regular professors who have PhDs in, in the disciplines. And they are often the ones where the first and second year students are together and they build that community. And it makes a huge difference as a foundation for these students. And so building community was one of the biggest concerns they had. And some of them were coming to me and say, oh, well, I've just realized I'm just not going to be able to build community in my class because it's online. I'm just going to live with it. And that was not what my experience of online learning was. I did my PhD online back in 2003 to 2006 with the University of Sheffield, and I built community, and I'm still in touch with a lot of people that I met there. So that was not my experience, and I've been building community online for years. It's just that people didn't have the amount of time that I had to do that, and they had to do it in the middle of a pandemic where everyone's mental well-being wasn't great. So I was like, how can I help change that? Oh, great to hear that some of you have used some of these activities. And so the other thing, noticing that people had inequitable access to faculty development support, so educational development support, and even if you had a good teaching and learning center in your institution, they were never meant to support every single person for a whole year. They were meant to support you when you needed them, and that was always a stress on everyone. So building community online is more important than ever because of the trauma of the pandemic, and at the same time, online teaching had never been so synchronous before. So a lot of the literature on online learning was not focused on how to do synchronous. And then a lot of people are doing synchronous because when you don't have experience developing and designing an online course and you don't have time to do that, synchronous is a little bit easier to get started. It's not going to work out very well necessarily, but it requires less prep time and planning and so on. I'm seeing a question in the chat, so if someone can keep that for a second, I'll come back to it. And then the values underpinning the design, again, intentionally equitable hospitality, and thinking about who has access to what kind of tools and technologies and whose culture is dominating the way we structure our activities, and who has political power in the way we design them. And then the other thing is when we created these activities, the adaptation was part of the design. So sort of telling you how do you design something ahead of time so that you can allow for different options to begin with, but also how do you adapt in the moment if you need to for care and equity. So I'm going to stop and see that question that was just asked. Just need to make my chat a little bit bigger. All right, so KBJ is saying, teacher as host is a fine concept, but does that imply student as guest? Presumably not. I'm trying to find a good vocabulary to describe the student in relation to the teacher as host. Okay, that's a good point. So first of all, I think it's important when we're trying to say we want to nurture students' agency to recognize that we have power as teachers in that situation. We may want to not have power, but we do. So we can't assume that the space is just open and nobody owns it. Somebody does own it, and someone has the responsibility to make students feel at home rather than guests, but they won't feel that way unless you intentionally do something about it. So that's sort of where I'm thinking about in that sense. So in virtually connecting specifically, someone is hosting a Zoom meeting. That will always be the case. There will never be a Zoom meeting that's just an open space that people jump into. If it's a discussion forum, someone is hosting that discussion forum and deciding on the settings and who's allowed to do what. So you can't pretend that it's not there. So you need to recognize what's there and then think about the ways in which you can create more participatory parity in that. So for example, in my students, now that Zoom allows you to have people move between breakout rooms, so now when I put students in breakout rooms because I have the power to do that, I can also set it up so that they can move between breakout rooms however they like. So that's an adaptation that you can make to make it a more equitable space, to give them more power to move themselves wherever they want to. And at the same time, recognizing that when you do allow that, is there potential for abuse? Might someone end up somewhere that makes another person uncomfortable? So just letting loose and saying, oh, it's a space for everyone and everyone's equal, that doesn't make it an equal space. I hope that helps. Jason, okay, well, your students are not necessarily wishing for a caring community. I think in the past, my students have generally said that that was what they liked most about my classes, this caring community aspect. I don't know if during the pandemic, pragmatism would ever come before care, but I'm not in your context, so I don't understand what's happening in your context. I do know that engineering professors, for example, in my institution, do resist this notion of care, but at the same time, the students need it. And I think it might be a sort of a language that maybe some people are uncomfortable with, but I don't think that anybody would resist feeling cared for or be upset unless that care becomes stifling. So, for example, a lot of care, for example, focuses on the body rather than the soul, and that can be stifling because you could say, thinking about, for example, the elderly during the pandemic and the whole thing of we care about your body, so we're not going to hug you because we're afraid that we're going to give you COVID. At the same time, they could get depression from not being touched, not being visited, right? So that would be a situation where I think care is problematic or is not straightforward, and it's not one way of caring. There are lots of different ways of caring. And then also when you think about how can we, hospitality is definitely cultural, I agree with that. And that's why the question is, who are you involving in the design of the space? Rather than being the hospitable person and deciding yourself, this is how I'm going to host the space. It's like, how do you involve them in the decision of how they want to be hosted? Especially if you have minorities who aren't used to speaking up, for example. All right. I'm going to keep going, and then if other things come up that I miss, someone can ask me again in the end. So some dimensions of the community building activities is how do you do introductions, and how do you consider safety of everyone in the space? What kind of warm-ups do you need, and how do you set the tone for your class, and then some ongoing community building and interaction, because a lot of times people think about how do I do intros, and then they assume the community is just going to keep going on itself. So in terms of introductions, one of the things that we started talking about is, do we do it synchronously or asynchronously? And people tend to want to do it synchronously, but there's so much benefit to doing it asynchronously because it gives people a chance to think about how they want to present themselves to others rather than be on the spot. And people who have anxiety and so on would rather not have to do it on the spot. And it also allows you to go back and look at someone again and remember what they had shared about themselves. So I do something with my students called an alt CV, where they get to describe themselves in whatever way they want to describe themselves. And I get to learn a lot of things about them that wouldn't come in a normal introduction of just like what their major is or whatever. One of the introductions that was proposed by another educator was story of your name, sharing the story of your name. And even though this is one of the most popular activities we have on the site, it has safety considerations in the sense of what if someone is trans and how would they feel about talking about the story of their name? What if someone has a painful history of their name or they've just changed their name for safety? So it's always really important to think about how would you propose the activity in a way that will allow someone to feel safe not participating or to participate in alternative ways. And whether you do it in the first day of class or after a while, after you've built some community. There's also another activity proposed by a Kenyan educator, which is about what kind of animal would you be? And there are cultural considerations here because even as she explained it, she talked about how some people resist it. And we learned from a South African educator that this is considered extremely, extremely problematic in post-apartheid South Africa to tell people to compare themselves to animals. So it's back to those cultural issues that you were all talking about. And then there was another one of give us a tour of where you are right now. And this is, again, equity issue because, first of all, some people are just not proud of their homes. They don't have privacy in their homes. Turning on their camera might be an issue, might be just a bandwidth issue. So there are all these things to keep in mind. And as we describe each of these activities, we talk through these. And even if you're not going to apply one of these activities exactly as it is, this might be an opportunity for you to just think about these things in terms of other activities you might do in your class. And then we have some activities that ask you to sort of look away from the screen and draw something on paper, like these surrealist drawings. And one of the things that's interesting about this activity is that it's not just about doing the drawing as an intro activity, but also about how can you use that activity to ask bigger questions about how does it feel to do something like this in a limited amount of time? What does it say about how we see each other and ourselves? The other thing that I think is really important in online activities is warm-up activities. For me, like just checking in at the beginning is really important, and asking students how they're feeling today. A lot of times they'll just say fine. So we have a lot of different ways. We have like these 4 ideas for checking in that are a little bit more creative, especially at the beginning when they're not used to, when they don't realize when you're asking how are you that you really mean how are you. I saw someone put a note about how we're underestimating the impact of the pandemic and the trauma of it. And I think it's so important to recognize it every single class and to know that some days won't be good days for some of the students, right? And then again, another activity that involves writing on paper is called Spiral Journal. It's one of my favorites, and it's one that when I use with adults or students or young people, it's very, very positive. And it involves like sort of reflecting and focusing off the screen and then deciding what to share with others rather than those other quick activities like what we were doing earlier. Do you do things that involve some kind of movement? And this one that I really like is called Opposites, which is a theater of the oppressed technique. Getting students to move, whether or not their cameras are on, is useful because we're all used to just sitting and staring at the screen in this very unnatural pose all day long, right? And then other ones that are just energizing, things like improv writing, and you're all language teachers, so just asking people to just share something in like 5 words and build a story off of each other, things like that, or something called PowerPoint karaoke, which my language teacher students really like, which is about showing images and having students improv presentation around it, which is really great for spontaneous speaking, but also fun and light, so they're learning, but it's also a way to be silly together, and that can help build trust if you've already got a little bit of trust going on to begin with. But always thinking about who you might exclude with some of these choices. So something like PowerPoint karaoke uses images, and if you have a student who's visually impaired, how do you provide like alternative text to make sure that they can participate in an activity like that? With something like improv, some people might get really anxious, so you might make sure that they get a chance to say pass or to come at the end of something like that so that they have enough time to think about it. Whereas something like Spiral Journal is slow and reflective and generally tends to be inclusive of most people. All right, I'm going to stop for a second and look at the chat because I've seen a lot of things happening here. Someone is asking me privately, yes, you can tweet the images on the slides. These are just screenshots from the website for community building. Helen's talking about online discussion workshops where students have space just to talk to each other. That's great. Stephen Brookfield. I love Stephen Brookfield's book, Becoming a Critical Reflective Teacher. Thanks for sharing that, Dustin. That's a really good book. I love Brookfield. Thank you, Lorraine. I'm glad you like these. I hope you enjoy watching them. So some of them are videos, and you can watch us actually doing the activity. And some of them you see us talking around the activity. I really enjoyed making the videos because a lot of them, and I'm going to talk about some of them a little bit more about why I made these as videos rather than just describing them. So setting the tone, I think, is really important. Letting people know what's in your heart and mind, because sometimes students don't really understand why we're doing this and what kind of tone we're trying to set up. And online, you have to make even more of an explicit way of doing it because they're not seeing you, and that warmth of being together is missing. So one of the things I love is annotating the syllabus. This is different than giving people a syllabus quiz to see if they've read it. This is about inviting students to comment on your syllabus and tell you what confuses them, what interests them, what do they want to know more about. And you can do it at the beginning of the semester, but you can do it also at the end of the semester. Oh, Ivona, you like seeing our kids? Yeah, I think that was fun. All right, Emma, if we have time at the end of the session, I'll explain spiral journaling in detail, okay? But the link is there, so you can actually watch the video of us doing it as well and download the slides. All right, so annotating the syllabus, you can do it at the beginning of the semester, middle of the semester as a way to get feedback. You can do it anytime, but it just invites students to know that they can comment on your course, that it's not something they're just receiving, that they can have an input into it. There's also a video on trauma-informed pedagogy. I see some of you are interested in that. And by the way, actually, I want to invite you to this session on trauma-informed pedagogy. Hold on a second. Actually, I'm just going to post the link, and it's the last announcement on Equity Unbound. So trauma-informed pedagogy, what I have there is that May Samed, who's one of the speakers on trauma-informed pedagogy during the pandemic, talking to me about what it means to ask your students, how is your heart? And how trauma, and letting students know how trauma influences their brain and why they might be struggling right now. And so this is one of the things that's there. And I asked my students to watch it at the beginning of the semester, and she's coming as a guest speaker in my class this Thursday. So if you're not going to be at the conference at 5 p.m. Cairo time, which is 4 p.m. UK time, you can join us. And I know I'm almost running out of time, so I'll just go through this real quick. I'm not running out of time, right? I have like 10 minutes. Can someone confirm?
No, you've got, it's only 10:23, so we've got another 20 minutes.
Great. All right. I'll try to make it 10 of me speaking and 10 for questions. All right. And gratitude journaling, which I've talked about, check that one out. We have a lot of resources there. Third places, which refers to what Helen was talking about, is like making space for people to socialize. I think we've ran into how do we make our educational spaces online, but university and education are not just about what we do in the classroom. It's also about bumping into each other at the cafe and seeing each other at the library and seeing each other crossing the street. And we don't have that with a pandemic with physical distancing, right? And so creating those third places needs to be intentional online. It's not going to happen on its own. I love that you have a social program for this conference. And one of the spaces that has helped me is Slack. So I use Slack. I don't know if in the UK you're allowed to do that for GDPR reasons. I don't know whether you follow that. But spaces in Egypt like WhatsApp and Slack have been helpful for that. Just social spaces where they can share GIFs and jokes and vent about problems. And this is where I knew about the kinds of things my students wanted for tests and that they wanted to have, to help with certain things. And we could chat about these things outside of class time whenever they wanted, and whoever was there would join in. They're like semi-synchronous, right? They don't all have to be there at the same time, but they can catch up later. And then one of the other things is community guidelines for like how do we participate and how we want to be together, and can we go to co-develop these with our students? It's kind of difficult, I think, to do it at the beginning of a semester if they haven't done it before, but it's something that you can keep working on together. And then for me, like doing a pre-survey early on. So one of the things I always ask in the pre-survey is how they feel about having their cameras on, and 90% of them prefer not to have them on, and they explain to me why. And so I never then pressure them to turn their cameras on because they've told me why. Another thing is if your institution gives you some leeway to do something like alternative grading, especially in a time of the pandemic, this can be so relieving to the stress of students if you can. Any ways that you can listen to students will set the tone for how your course is and what it might mean to them. And so find ways to open space to listen to them, and listen to all of them, not just the ones who speak up. There will be a few who are vocal, but they may not represent everyone. So make sure you have spaces where you invite everyone to participate. And then for me, the most important thing is this ongoing community building. And liberating structures. Has anyone heard of liberating structures? So it's liberatingstructures.com. And these are microstructures, ways of structuring conversations online so that everyone has a voice, and it sort of unleashes your creativity and helps with faster problem solving. They're kind of magical, really, some of them. But if you read them on the site, it's not always easy to imagine how to do them. And it's not always easy to imagine how to do them online. There's a lot of free meetups if you want to experience them, but if you don't have the time to do that, so many of them are recorded here with people demoing them. So the Conversation Cafe is one that ensures that when you put students in breakout rooms and you ask them to discuss something, it doesn't have like one or two people dominating the conversation, everyone else really quiet. There's also for me the importance of promoting peer reciprocity. So having students help each other and not always seek us to help them. And Troika Consulting is one of those structures that puts 3 students together and in a very short time allows them to help each other and realize that they are resources for each other and they don't always need to seek our help every time. And then also ensuring the students are engaging in different ways. TRIZ is an activity, again, one of the liberating structures that sort of takes problem solving upside down and helps you think of things in a really creative way, especially if it's a difficult topic to talk about or people are going to get defensive about it. So check those out. I won't have time to explain every one of them. And you are invited to contribute as well. So if you have an activity that you've tried in your classes that's really useful, that you think might be helpful to others, you can submit it here. You can submit it in text form, or if you want to film the video with me, I'm happy to join you and do it together. I'm inviting my students to contribute this time around. And I will almost stop now. Just asking you to think, if you are in an institution where you're being asked to do something like a Hyflex classroom or a dual delivery thing in the near future, given that some people will be vaccinated and some won't, and some people want to go back and some don't. This is actually much more complex than teaching fully online, just so you know, in case you don't know that, because it involves being hospitable in 2 different spaces and making those 2 spaces connect. Think about intentionally equitable hospitality. The article that we've written about this is short, but we're going to do an updated version for classrooms. But intentionally equitable hospitality was developed for hybrid situations. And it's all about how do you have a host in 2 different spaces and how do the people who are involved become hospitable to each other. Because you don't want the situation where the students who are in class are frustrated by those online or the opposite, and that kind of situation. And I want to end in a note of hope. And I remember, Emma, that you want to see the spiral journal. So if we have time, we'll do that at the very end. But thinking about hope is not about, we need to be discontent with the present and desire a better future. It's not about ignoring that. But sometimes also our pain can serve as a beacon enabling us to move forward so we can begin to heal. I think we might find cures for the pandemic, for the disease itself. I think it's going to take time to heal from the after effects of it, and it has not been equitably distributed between us all. So I will stop here and ask you to share in the chat one key takeaway that you're taking away from this today, and I'm going to download this chat and enjoy it afterwards. And this is my last slide, which just invites you. Here's the slide deck again, my email, my Twitter. Feel free to reach out at any time. And I also have a feedback form for my keynotes. So if you'd like to give me feedback on my keynotes, you can go to bit.ly/Bali notes.